Good morning, friends. I am David Sundar Singh. Uh, I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of International Justice Mission. Of course, today is 11th July. International Justice Mission organizing a webinar on entitlement of minimum wage, a fundamental right. I am taking this time to welcome all of you, especially the speakers, His Lordship Honorable Justice P. Sathasivam, former Chief Justice of India, Dr. Carrie Ford, uh, Executive Director, Center for Applied Research in Human Trafficking, University of Cambridge, and Dr. Shantanu Dutta, Specialist, Thought Leadership, International Justice Mission. And Merlin Freeda is going to be the person, Director of Operations, International Justice Mission. I welcome all of you. It's a very mixture of different audience. Of course, we have media, judges, advocates, and also prosecutors, members of Legislative Assembly, and social workers, NGO persons, civil servants, law students. I'm taking this time to welcome all of you. And one more person I want to welcome, our Mr. Emilias, the Additional Advocate General, Government of Tamil Nadu, is also in the panel. Thank you so much. And I welcome all of you. This is a time over to Merlin, madam.
Thank you, Advocate David Sundar Singh. A very good morning to everyone, respected delegates, panelists, participants. It's my pleasure and honor to be your moderator at this webinar on entitlement of minimum wage, a fundamental right. Once again, a very warm welcome to one and all. Wanted to introduce International Justice Mission. It's a global organization that helps protect people in poverty from violence and exploitation, irrespective of their gender, religion, community, race, and ethnicity. IJM partners with local governments to combat human trafficking and other forms of violence against women and children. We help the government rescue victims of violence. We bring offenders to justice. We restore survivors, and we strengthen the public justice system. Our work is actually inspired by the idea of rule of law and justice, especially for those who are unable to access justice as enshrined in the Constitution of India. IGM India works with and supports criminal justice system across the country. Our lawyers, social workers, expert consultants are engaged in casework, developing systemic solutions to improve the efficiency of justice delivery and to empower victims through care and counseling programs. I'm very much honored to inform this wonderful gathering that so far we have helped around 20,000 individuals by rescuing them from trafficking crimes and providing them rehabilitation service. And we have been able to equip around 50,000 plus police and judicial officers across the country and build efficiency, effectiveness to their work. Today we have esteemed speakers amidst us. They will speak us today on a very crucial topic, entitlement of minimum wage, a fundamental right. I repeat the topic again, entitlement of minimum wage, fundamental right. We are all here because you and I believe that criminal justice system must actively protect the rights of every citizen as guaranteed to them by the Indian Constitution. When it comes to laborers, there are many labor laws in the country, and that were enacted with an aim of protecting the rights of the laborers. Labor laws are essential for ensuring fundamental rights for our workers. Rights, again, that are guaranteed by the Indian Constitution to all Indian citizens at all times. And today we are going to focus on one such important law, that is the Minimum Wages Act 1948. Every citizen, every laborer has the right to receive minimum wages. You all would agree with me on that. But what happens is the payment of minimum wages to laborers has always been seen as a labor issue and looked upon very leniently. The failure to meet this standard set by the government of India on the part of the employer is certainly a violation of the fundamental rights of a citizen. And so I'm saying that it's a crime if you violate this act of minimum wage. You're violating the fundamental right of a person, of a laborer, and so it's a crime. According to the provisions under the Indian Penal Code as well as under the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act 1976, minimum wage is a vital component in the labor exploitation cases. And today's discussion on minimum wage is increasingly relevant. I would again repeat, increasingly relevant with the introduction of the new wage code issued by the central government. Hence, in both Minimum Wage Act and New Code Wage 2019, all persons who do not pay wages, which is a basic fundamental right of citizens, can be punished with imprisonment and fine. That's what we are going to hear from the speakers today. We have three speakers today, three eminent speakers: Justice Peter Sathasivam, Dr. Carrie Pemberton Ford, and we have Dr. Shantanu Dutta with us. So I am now requesting Dr. Carrie Pemberton Ford, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Cambridge Center for Applied Research in Human Trafficking, University of Cambridge, to speak to us on the international standards pertaining to minimum wages. So this is the topic. She is going to throw light on the international standards pertaining to minimum wages. A quick introduction about her. She has done a lot. I don't know how I will be able to do a quick introduction doing justice to what all that she has achieved. Anyway, I'll try my best. She's a popular speaker and a prolific author with numerous policy evaluation and strategic direction papers submitted to a range of enforcement, international, governmental and non-governmental organizations. Dr. Ford lectures widely in the UK and even across internationally. She has been a panelist and platform speaker on events addressing trafficking in Switzerland, Romania, and the list is quite large for me to read. She has been developing papers on issues pertaining to child rights and protections. Dr. Ford held a UNITA fellowship advising UN Institute of Training and Research in issues pertaining to human trafficking and gender equality, particularly in relation to the peacekeeping and sustainable developmental goals. Her presentation into NATO's high-level symposia on the impact of heightened migratory flows into the Balkans is currently being developed into a paper on the subject. And if you would like to access that, please reach out to her. It's going to be in the libraries across the globe very soon. Dr. Carrie has worked extensively in the field of raising the profile of the contribution of civil society responses when it comes to trafficking. Carrie has taught and supervised graduates in several universities. And again, the university list is quite long, and the best interest of the time, I am not reading all of those. So please welcome Dr. Ford to speak on the international standards on minimum wage. Over to you, Dr. Ford, for the next 25 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation to be part of such an esteemed committee panel for this day, looking at the impact of minimum wage legislation interventions. I think what I want to do is set this into a broader context, if I may, from the international standpoint, and to place the whole discourse around international minimum wage interventions back into where it started off from, which was actually in one of Britain's other former colonies. You know, our colonial past sort of is a long shadow for us in terms of where minimum wage started off in New Zealand and Australia, trying to address some of the poverty issues that were breaking out there at the back of the 19th century. And the thing about the minimum wage is that, as one of your great economists Amartya Sen took hold of in the 80s and 90s, looking at how to build resilience against food poverty. It's really important to put the economy back into the bottom layers of society, where demand for the basic essentials is going to be deployed. And that's the way that you build, if you can, some level of food security and household security at the base. So this is the idea of the national minimum wage, is that it builds resilience into the wider economy. It builds resilience and benefit for the wider society. And so although you've posited it as an essential human right, I would say that alongside that, people need to understand that whilst building a rights-based system, you're also building resilience for the whole of society. Because if you lose your bottom section of society, the people who are actually doing the levels of unskilled labor, and I'm putting that in inverted commas because I think every laborer has a skill set. It may not be our intellectual skill set, it may not be the legal frame skill set, it may not be advocacy skill set. It is a skill set, and without those skills, actually the whole of society suffers. And the point about the national minimum wage is, as Keynes pointed out, he's a Cambridge scholar and economist, he pointed out in the early 30s, 40s, that what needed building resilience was the demand side of the whole economic cycle. If you can create enough resilience at the bottom of the pyramid, the whole of society, the whole of the economy benefits. And that really is what informed the establishment, the advocacy for a minimum wage. It wasn't so much driven by this is a human right, this is a human entitlement. It was driven by this is the way that the most coherent, humane, humanitarian, respectful, modern, liberal societies in which we care for one another and which the whole society benefits from is built through creating a minimum remuneration for labour. That builds the best resilience. And I think it's one of the arguments that needs to be strengthened in our discussions on this topic, that actually the whole of the economy, and remember that economy means the welfare, the smooth running of the whole household, the household being our global reality, our global economy. That is the oikos that economy is supposed to capture. And as I elaborate some of my points, I'm going to bring us back to that oikos, because the oikos situates us on this planet, our fragile planet, which the SDGs have reminded us is a planet that actually feeds us and on which we totally rely. We have no other place to go than this planet. We have to take care of this planet. This planet looks after us. So that's part of the oikos. The rest of the oikos, which I will come back to, because it's something that doesn't actually get captured appropriately by simply looking at the minimum wage. And that is who actually does the social reproduction in our economy. And that labor is the labor of women who are frequently outside of the formal structures of a minimum wage structure, because they're outside of the formal structures of labor, which has been typically elaborated around the male laborer. And that section of our economy, over 51, 52%, depends which society you're in. I haven't got the actual stats for India. One of the IGM team will be able to fill me in on that. But that labour, that social reproduction labour, is critically important for the welfare of the whole of the economy, whether it's the whole of the economy of India or the economy of other states. Certainly the globe is dependent on that labour of social reproduction, not just biological reproduction, but the reproduction of elaborating, bringing to maturity our next generation. And that sector is actually much more involved in the informal economy, and it's the informal economy that needs to be particularly addressed. It's quite challenging to know how to address that informal economy, and it's within that informal economy that human trafficking absolutely has a field day. Traffickers have a field day of divesting the informal economy of those most vulnerable and pushing them and pulling them into an even more informal economy, which is the sub-legal, illegal, illicit, human rights totally violating economy of trafficking. So that's the perspective I come from, being a specialist in human trafficking, which for those of you who aren't up to speed on human trafficking, before the COVID crisis was set at anything between 27 million and 42 million people globally caught in this various hydra-headed monster, which the head of the UNHCR nominated it 20 years ago, a hydra-headed monster. You chop off one neck and another one emerges, because it is having this field day in the economy beyond the legal framework. And this is one of the challenges when we look at intentionally going for the minimum wage, protecting that minimum wage. It's a very important sector to pay attention to, the lowest paid within the formal economy. And I have to say that what we need to also look at very seriously is the whole informal economy that sits outside of that elaboration. So I just want to underpin why the minimum wage has been seen by the International Labour Organization as critical for nations to both sign into, but also deeply respect, because it is one of the pillars of protecting society from the ravages, really, of impoverishment. We know what happened in Bengal in 1943, where hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people died completely unnecessarily in a harvest that was good and plentiful, but got diverted from those who were at most need of being able to purchase. In fact, it probably underpinned the reason why in 48 you had a minimum wage enforcement placed inside your legal structures, because it was seen that although the harvest was plentiful at that time, because there was, it wasn't a supply-led famine that occurred, it was a demand-led famine that was realized for both the rural and the peripheral urban populations of Bengal at that time, because the harvest had been slaked off, if you like, by the intervention of extraneous government forces, at that time British interests. Britain was prosecuting a global war at that point, and food was required in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon, for the forces, for the troops that had gathered there. And so this messed up the normal food security for Bengal. It meant that prices rose, and the fixed economy of those in Bengal, particularly those farmers and agriculturalists, couldn't respond to even being able to purchase back their own rice provisions. And this tragedy, I mean, a human-made tragedy occurred at the base of this. And this is why the minimum wage is seen as one of the intervention points for strengthening the base of our population's ability to realize food security. And in case people aren't particularly au fait with the risks that are presently with us because of COVID-19 on food security, I will draw our attention to what the UN Food and Agricultural Organization is saying about what's going on inside our agricultural supply chain, where we know that food production, particularly from small producers, is now seriously at risk. And at many points of the food supply chain, there are what we can only call COVID shocks taking place, where even at processing levels, there are clusters of COVID infections that are closing down these necessary points in the supply chain, thus provoking major challenges to international food security. And of course, those who get most liable to getting vulnerable on that chain are those at the bottom of the economic access, those with the less than the market pricing of the food stocks available. And so at this time, you know, it's even more necessary to be looking at that minimum wage as a policy that is upheld, and is upheld in law, and is upheld across the culture, because the law is a fairly blunt instrument. It is an instrument, it's a fantastic tool, but it is a bit like a mallet. And what's needed in that toolbox for protection of people's essential economic access to the essentials, the Maslowian essentials, if you like, of food, shelter, clothing, is to have resilience right across their earning power. And that means that you have to have everybody who is in the process of purchasing people's labor to be respecting the essentially fairness. It's interesting that Amartya Sen, who I was referencing a little bit earlier, writes this book called The Idea of Justice, and inside it he talks extensively about the idea of fairness and respect for each other. And I have to say that alongside attention to upholding SDG 16, which is attention to your institutions, peaceful institutions, institutions of justice, alongside that, there needs to be a attention to our cultural replication of that. This needs to be something that every citizen carries in their heads, that everybody has a right to justice, fairness, fair remuneration for work undertaken. And in fact, if everybody was walking around with that perception, we wouldn't have a situation where globally we have upwards of, according to the Global Slavery Index, 42 million in forced labor, slave-like conditions, human trafficking. It wouldn't be possible, because it would be culturally impossible for anybody to so enslave, so disable their fellow citizen. It would just be impossible. So that is something that is a cultural transformation that needs to take place, and that impacts, and I'm talking SDG languages here, so if you're a little bit adrift on the SDGs, can I advise you either to drop onto our website, where you'll see the SDGs very much elaborated around how they impact human trafficking. So that's on our CART website. You'll be able to see that later, ccarht.org, or onto the UN websites, where the SDGs now are starting to be manifested very explicitly, because we've got 10 more years, only 10 more years till 2030, when they'll be looked at to see whether they're doing their job. So the minimum wage, Keynes saw as one of the best forces for democratization and stabilization. It also actually is a very low leakage, right on target incentive for labour market focused interventions. It also signals for the government an intention to do right by its citizens and to promote a sense of justice. So this is all very good stuff. However, I would say however, the informal economy in India is a profoundly present economy. It's a peri-economy, it's a sub-economy, it's an economy in which there is high flexibility and elasticity of labour. And that's something, of course, that businesses love, is elasticity of labour that doesn't bring in all sorts of other built-in costs that they don't want to take, because, of course, business wants to be as slim and as agile as it can be, carrying as little on costs as possible, and certainly not wanting to take them on in the person of its most unskilled labourers. However, and it does also work at one level for those who don't and can't fit into what has been seen as a structured formal economy. Now, in the formal economy, you get a lot of restrictions, both for business, but also for the supply side of labour. And of course, with women, and women during their childbirthing years and their child nurturing years, inside a patriarchally based economy, which is something that actually dominates across the world, women have the majority of child nurturing tasks and household fulfilling social reproduction tasks, and they are essentially outside of that structured business oriented life, because their life is dominated by the life of keeping the social reproduction of the domestic arena going. That's the way that it's been configured for generations, and it's the way it's configured with the minimum wage. Women are outside of it. There's an interesting book, and it's going to show up upside down, I think. Oh no, it isn't. It's on the computer. It goes the right way around. It's called "Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner?" And those of you who are economists looking in at the moment, I would recommend that you dip into this book. It is not highly technical, although it's based on very technical research by Catherine Marcel, essentially saying that the economic models that we've been living with and driving through since essentially the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, and it's proliferated across the globe about what makes up the economy, is essentially a male economy, and actually obliterates, pays no attention to the economy that is going on, that is servicing the male economy, which is the economy of the female social reproduction that goes on uncounted. Now, more recently, the World Bank, the IMF, the ILO is starting to get into that conversation to say, what does it look like if we build an economic elaboration that actually counts in the labour of women? And inside that goes the informal labour of women. Because when we look at trafficking figures, some of the things that we see inside those figures is a very substantial percentage. I mean, over 60%, as currently counted, of the trafficked and enslaved and chattelage labour that goes on is female. And now not all of that is in the domain of sex trafficking, though a large percentage is. A lot of it is also labor trafficking or forced labor trafficking inside, say, the garment industry, inside, say, the construction industry, road construction, etc. Lots of those categories are not captured in minimum wage interventions. They are captured in the informal economy, and our policies, our governmental policies, our economic advice, our legal frameworks need to be adjusted to address this wider real-time economy in which we all live. An economy we've managed to really have, I wear very focal glasses, and I would say that to look at the economy simply as a male-dominated economy is to be operating with one lens set. If you then build in looking at the informal economy and the economy that simply isn't counted at all, which is women's labour inside the domestic space of social reproduction, then you start wearing varifocals and you can actually see not only your computer screen, but that which is all around us in the real world. And in fact, our virtual world is a very good illustration as a metaphor of what we're seeing when we look at classical economic responses to our economic predicaments. And we need to be looking with varifocals, and we need to be looking offline as well as online, because actually what sustains our online world is everything that's going on inside the offline world. And that's a very good metaphor for the difference between looking at male constructed economic models about principally male-led institutional economic production, and the wider economic production and the securitization, the food securitization that needs to take place so that populations are able to flourish and everybody, children, females, and males as an entire society can flourish. So where is the minimum wage in relationship to that? What needs to happen? Well, I would say that the research that's been taking place in terms of creating secure, socially economic viable units that are not displaced, because it's the displacement of people that causes the chaos in which trafficking and chattelage and what's called modern enslavement occurs. It occurs in the chaos. It occurs in the cracks that emerge from when the social cohesion, the food security, the safety of the wider household and communities are disrupted. We need to have a plethora of interventions alongside the minimum wage. The minimum wage is one of those strands. It's one of those strands. It's an extremely important strand, but it's not the only strand that needs to be in place during this time of COVID shock. Because what we read from the UN analysis on this is that even in this last 3 months, something like 149 million have been drawn into under the poverty line. COVID continues going for another 3-4 months, the way it's been doing, presenting a shock to the global economy in the last 3 months. We will be into 300 million under new people under the poverty line. And those people under the poverty line actually affect the wider economies of the countries in which they're set. I have to say, another book that is well worth returning to, not all the solutions at all, but not enough attention paid to it in the 80s when it was produced, the North-South report, was an independent commission of the international development issues under the chairmanship of the German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Worth looking at because, of course, what Willy points out, what Brandt points out on this, is that we've got a real disconnect between countries that are doing well in the allocation or the capture of global resource, both of labor and of agricultural as well as mineral resources required for flourishing in modern society, and those that are the source countries frequently of those essential raw materials and agricultural materials. And Brandt says that there needed to be a new institution that looked at really moving some of the financial strengths of the northern economies into the southern economies as part of a rebalancing. Now, I don't know how where India is at in terms of those sorts of conversations, both in its own region, but also in terms of the north-south discussions. I do think COVID-19 offers an amazing opportunity, actually. I mean, it is a horrendous attack on the safety of human beings. It's a pandemic that has had already lethal consequences and will continue to have so. But some of its deeper impact is going to be around the economic welfare and health of our different nation-state economies. We know that the boundarying, the sealing up of movement of human beings, and that is also trade that has happened because of COVID, is having profound impacts on the economy. It's slowing the economy down. It's making it less fluid, but it does give us the opportunity as an international forum to sit down and go, actually, yes, minimum wage, but also what are we doing about rebalancing our economies so that we do actually build our economies on the basis of nobody left behind, no children left behind. I just referenced the number of children, and IJM, I'm sure, will make a reference to this, the number of children who go missing every year inside India. We're up into the lower 100 million going missing, and in Bangladesh and in Nepal. These are all those who are left behind because our economy is out of whack, and that those at the bottom of the economic security line actually then lose their children. Now, no mother wants to lose her child. I tell you that. I'm just recently 3 days into being a granny, and my daughter's just had her daughter. There is no way a woman births a child if they've got economic security at any level and gives that child away. There is no way. It is a matter of poverty. So the number one of the SDGs, which is no poverty, absolutely has to be respected. I'm so pleased it's number one. It is number one, no poverty. We're being called to pay attention today on how do we realize that. And one of those strands is the attention both to paying a minimum wage, but also, as I've said, we need to broaden this whole discussion out to saying, how do we address gender inequality, SDG 5? How do we bring quality education so that everybody can be participating in what we are part of, this revolution of the knowledge economy? We know that we're leaving millions behind in technical illiteracy for both educational and supply of the technical hardware required to be part of that knowledge economy. What are we doing about that? What are we doing
Dr. Carrie,
addressing? 1 minute.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. You have 2 minutes. I'm very sorry to be rude to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I've got 1 minute. No worries. I was drawing to an end. I saw your fabulous features pop up. So I'll wrap it in one. What are we doing about quality education? What are we doing about the informal sector? What are we doing about gender inequality? What are we doing about provision of health? These are all part of the pillars of creating a safe underpinning of both our national economy, our regional economies, and our global economy. And COVID has delivered a shock to every economy in the world. And it gives an opportunity for us to sit at both national, regional, and global levels to take a hard look. Actually, the SDGs is a perfectly good framework to be looking at how do we strengthen our societies to be those that pay attention to those at the most risk, because those at the most risk actually are part of the powering of our wider economy. They're the ones we've ignored, but the ones we tend to ignore. Pay attention to the ones we ignore. Work out our policies so that they have attention, fairness, and justice brought to them. And then we strengthen the whole. Back to you, and I hope I've done some justice to the elaboration of the subject in hand.
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrie. By the way, congratulations on becoming a granny. Your presentation certainly helped us widen the perspective on global significance and standards that are attached to minimum wages. You helped us understand the significance of providing minimum wages during this time of COVID, and you also touched upon SDGs, gender inequality, illiteracy. Thank you so much for bringing light into those issues that are connected with minimum wages. It is indeed true that minimum wage is a fundamental right of every citizen, and it needs to be prioritized to protect people from exploitation. We are moving on to the next session. Today's discussion on minimum wage is again increasingly relevant with the introduction of the new wage code issued by the central government. I already said that. Hence, in both the Minimum Wage Act 1948 and New Code Wage 2019, all persons who do not pay wages, which is a basic fundamental right of citizens, can be punished with imprisonment and fine. Who can better provide insight on this topic other than the former Chief Justice of India, Justice P. Sathasivam? During his tenure as a judge of Madras High Court and judge of High Court of Punjab and Haryana, and as a judge of the Supreme Court and then as a Chief Justice of India, Justice P. Sathasivam has heard and passed several judgments pertaining to labor and issues relating to human rights. Honorable Justice Sathasivam was sworn in as 40th Chief Justice of India in 2013, and he has, to his credit, several path-breaking judgments, which includes the Reliance Gas judgment, wherein he observed that in a democracy like ours, the national assets belong to the people and the same should be explored through public sector undertakings. He also authored leading judgments in electoral reforms. We all know that. He is soft-spoken, courteous, unfailingly polite, according to those people who worked with him inside and outside of the court. After his retirement as Chief Justice, he was appointed as Governor of Kerala, wherein he pioneered a quality improvement drive in higher education by instituting the Chancellor's Award for the best university in the state. This effort was hailed nationwide and emulated by other states. In 2016, he created history by becoming the first governor to cast his vote in the assembly elections. His humility, keen-eyed interest in agriculture, concern for welfare of farmers and the poor, and commitment to social justice and democratic values have made him the people's governor. We are so honored to have you with us this morning, sir, and we look forward to hearing your views on minimum wage as a fundamental right under Article 21 and Article 23 of the Indian Constitution. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, madam. My greetings to everyone. At the outset, I convey my best wishes to Mr. C. Emilias, Additional Advocate General, Government of Tamil Nadu, who is responsible for this webinar. And I need not mention about the topic assigned to me, but for the purpose of clarity, I am saying minimum wage, a fundamental right under Article 21 and 23 of the Indian Constitution. As the earlier speaker mentioned, the coronavirus pandemic wreaks havoc on labor market worldwide. Today's topic of discussion is most relevant in this time of crisis. All countries worldwide are rolling out emergency stimulus packages to support livelihood of laborers. Our government, I am mentioning both central and state government, announced significant schemes to support the vulnerable millions of working people during this never seen catastrophe in our times. These steps by the government is a reflection that India is indeed a welfare state, where every legislative effort is made in the direction to ensure welfare, equitable rights, and social justice for the laborers. Friends, a plethora of labor laws have been enacted to ensure elevated health, safety, and welfare of workers to protect them against oppressive terms. Initially, minimum wages covered relatively only few categories of workers and sought to protect those considered be especially vulnerable. New Zealand was the first country to implement the minimum wages in 1894, followed by Australian state of Victoria in 1896 and the UK in 1909. After the Second World War, the number of countries with minimum wages expanded. Newly independent countries such as India in 1948 and our neighbor Pakistan in 1961 were among those adopting minimum wages. It is my duty to inform what is minimum wage. The Indian Constitution, which was enacted on 26th November 1949, has defined a living wage, that is the level of income for a worker which will ensure a basic standard of living, including good health, dignity, comfort, education, and provide for any contingency. However, to keep in mind an industry's capacity to pay, the Constitution has defined a fair wage. Fair wage is that a level of wage that not just maintains a level of employment, but seeks to increase it, keeping in perspective the industry's capacity to pay. Respected audience, India introduced the Minimum Wages Act in 1948, giving both the central government and state government simultaneous jurisdiction in fixing wages. The act is legally non-binding but statutory. Wage boards are set up to review the industry's capacity to pay and fix minimum wages, and that they at least cover a family of four's requirements of calories, shelter, clothing, education, medical assistance, and entertainments. Next important question is, minimum wage is fundamental right. The right to minimum wages has been recognized as a fundamental right by the Supreme Court of India, which has held that non-payment of minimum wages to be a violation of Article 21 and 23 of our Constitution. Here I have to say, Part 3 of the Indian Constitution provides fundamental rights, and in that Article 21, which speaks about protection of life and personal liberty, and Article 23 speaks about rights against exploitation. Any contravention is an offense punishable in accordance with the law. Any wage paid below the promised money but above the minimum wage is a labor dispute. But any wage paid below minimum wage is a violation of fundamental rights. Constitutional protection guaranteed to our laborers. I will explain in detail. The state, in order to streamline socio-economic reforms, is bound to respect the dignity and worth of the citizens. In the state of Mysore versus workers of gold mines, the reported judgment of the Supreme Court, AER 1958, Supreme Court 923, the Honorable Supreme Court has stated that, I quote a sentence from that decision, I quote, "The concept of social and economic justice is a living concept of revolutionary import. It gives sustenance to the rule of law, meaning and significance to the ideal of the welfare state," unquote. The Indian Constitution guarantees essential human rights in the form of fundamental rights under Part 3 and also directive principles of state policy in Part 4, which are fundamental in the governance of our country. The need for protecting and safeguarding the interest of labor has been enshrined in many articles. Article 14, 16, 19, 21, 23, and 24, giving an idea of the conditions under which labor had to be for work. The fundamental rights are not an end in themselves, but are the means to an end. The end is specified in directive principles of state policy. It is in this sense that fundamental rights and directive principles together constitute the core of our Constitution and combine to form its conscience. anything that destroys the balance between the two parts will ipso facto destroy an essential element of the basic structure of our Constitution. This has been enunciated in Minerva Mills versus Union of India, AR 1980, Supreme Court, page 1789. Article 32 and 226 of the Constitution provides for a remedy to enforce fundamental rights through Supreme Court and High Courts respectively. Next, I am going to explain wages, integral and intrinsic part of human rights. The Minimum Wages Act 1948 primarily safeguards the interest of workers in unorganized sector and sets out the minimum wages that must be paid to skilled, semi-skilled, as well as unskilled laborers. A minimum wage not only guarantees bare subsistence and preserves efficiency, but also provides for education, medical requirements, and some level of comforts too. According to legal glossary, the expression wages means a comprehensive or remuneration given to a hired person for his or her services. The word wages is integral and intrinsic part of human rights. Article 21 of our Constitution is a guarantee to life and liberty. Right to life means something more than the survival or animal existence. It includes the right to live with human dignity. It includes all those aspects of life which makes a man's life very meaningful, complete, and worth living. It includes in its ambit the right of a person to receive equitable and fair. The state cannot deprive any one of the precious, valuable right to live with human dignity. Non-payment of just and fair wages violates Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Indeed, any kind of withholding or withdrawal of wages without an opportunity of hearing to the employee concerned and without a proper disciplinary inquiry amounts to taking forced labor, which is prohibited under Article 23 of the Constitution. Likewise, payment of wages below the minimum wage rate also amounts to forced labor. The courts on various occasions, both High Courts and Supreme Court, termed non-payment of minimum wages as unconscionable and unpardonable, and stated that minimum wages are the basic requirements of the workman, and an industry which employs workmen without paying them their minimum wages has no right to continue. Further, that non-payment of minimum wages or reluctance on the part of employer in paying the minimum wage is not only illegal, inhuman, and immoral, but also attracts criminal liability on the head of the employer. Some employers are often seen prejudicially denying salary or earned wages on the ground that initial entry into service of employee was somehow irregular or illegal. The Honorable Supreme Court held that the plea of invalidity of appointment and similar disputes relating to nature of appointment and engagement of employee cannot be raised for the purpose of payment of earned wages. The Supreme Court held that even in the case of illegal appointment, the person is entitled for payment of salary for the period he has worked. Another very important judgment, the Honorable Supreme Court has held in Center Electricity Supply of Odisha versus Shahu. It is reported in AR 2014, Supreme Court 283, that I quote, denial of pay for the service tantamount to forced labor, which is impermissible when an appointment is admitted and incumbent functions in the post and neither suspended nor removed from service. He is entitled to get salary, for it is his legal right and it is duty of the employer to pay it as per terms and conditions of appointment. Thus, unquote. Thus, the judiciary has been an active guardian of labor rights when there is a breach of the same. I repeat, the judiciary has been active guardian of labor rights when there is a breach of the same. The impact of global pandemic on labor laws. I have to compare these problems with the prevailing situation. In the wake of global pandemic and the nationwide lockdown, a heavy constraint has been put on individuals as well as the economy. To minimize the impact of pandemic on the general public as well as business establishments and the interruption in the supply chain, many amendments, advisories, announcements have been introduced. It is axiomatic that these amendments must be in consonance with the fundamental rights guaranteed to labor, as also the directive principles of state policy, which enjoin the state to further the interest of labor in its politics or in its policies. Any legal changes will inevitably challenged in court and must meet constitutional standards to survive such challenge. In People's Union for Democratic versus Union of India, even in 1982, Supreme Court held that laws protecting labor, protecting contract labor and interstate migrant workmen were intended to ensure human dignity, basic human dignity. Violating these laws would violate the right to life under Article 21. Further, the court held the forced labor prohibited by Article 23 included not just physical force, but also the threat of imprisonment or fine. Today, to take one example, the Uttar Pradesh temporary exemption from certain labor laws ordinance 2020 suspends the operation of all labor laws in the state for the next 3 years, with the exception of the Bonded Labor System Act 1976, Section 5 of Payment of Wages Act 1936, and the Employees Compensation Act 1923, provisions of Factories Act and Building and Other Construction Workers Act 1996 relating to the safety and security of workmen have been retained. Also, a petition has been filed in the Supreme Court by activists pointing out that migrant workers are unable to earn their wages because of the ongoing nationwide lockdown enforced by the government since March 25 to contain the spread of corona disease, that is COVID-19 outbreak. The petition stated that lockdown order ignores the harsh realities that workers have to persistently face in the cities, that is further compounded when the order deprives them of their jobs, daily wages, and as a result, means of survival, thus violating their rights under Article 21, that is the right to life. The Honorable Supreme Court sought the response of central government in a plea to ensure payments of minimum wages to all migrant workers who are either employed by the companies or contractors or self-employed within a week. Since the matter is still pending in the Honorable Supreme Court, I'm not elaborating further. Finally, in my view, states must be mindful in their actions and avoid suspending or amending existing labor laws drastically to try to curb the impact of COVID-19 mandated lockdown. The objective to increase investment and employment by relaxing the labor law is optimistic of the government. However, it also a reality that actions cannot be taken which are patently illegal from constitutional perspective. Even the situation of a global pandemic due to COVID-19 would not justify any actions neglecting the labor force of our country. In fact, it is particularly in these times that the state must take steps in order to protect their interests. It is the responsibility of both the state and the employer to work hand in hand for achieving social justice for the laborers. The state has constitutional responsibilities and the employers have statutory responsibility, and the combination of the two, state and the employers, the combination of the two types of responsibilities tend to create an ideal society. I once again thank the organizers, particularly Mr. C. Emilias and his entire team for selecting this topic and lecture through webinar. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Justice Sathasivam. Your presentation elucidated the relation between minimum wage and fundamental rights of citizens under Article 21 and 23 of the Indian Constitution. You carefully removed layers of misapprehensions and depicted that non-payment of minimum wages is a criminal offense. You said non-payment of minimum wages is not only illegal, inhuman, immoral, but you also said it attracts criminal liability. And you said judiciary has been an active guardian of labor rights when there is a breach of the same. Thank you very much, sir. So
Thank you,
encouraging
ma'am.
to hear this from you. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, all of us know that if this law is not effectively enforced, the laborers who live a hand-to-mouth existence will be at risk. Losing even one day's earning on wages, on wages, will definitely lead their entire family become unable to afford a meal the next day. I repeat, losing even one day's earnings or wages will lead their entire family to become unable to afford a meal the next day. We now have Dr. Shantanu Dutta, Senior Specialist in Thought Leadership from International Justice Mission, to speak to you on the impact of minimum wage on sustainable economic recovery in India. Dr. Shantanu Dutta is a medical doctor by training. After serving his stint in the Indian Air Force, he moved on to serve in NGO sector, serving Indian and international agencies since 1990. He has been serving with IJM for the past 8 years. He achieved a lot, and he doesn't want me to share all of that here in the best interest of the time. Now, over to Dr. Shantanu Dutta. He is going to speak to us on the impact of minimum wage on sustainable economic recovery in India. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, distinguished panelists, distinguished participants. The topic assigned to me is the impact of minimum wage on sustainable economic recovery within the larger ambit of minimum wages as a fundamental right. I want to go a little away from this for a minute, because this gives the premise that only employed people who get a wage are players in the economy of the country, and that people who are unemployed, people who are retired, and otherwise unable to actively participate in the quote-unquote wage economy are passive players. And I want to go a step further and ignite a debate which has happened to some extent. If you look at the Economic Survey of India of 2017 and Chapter 40, you will see references to Universal Basic Income, UBI, and this has even been piloted in a small way in Madhya Pradesh, but it has not been taken up. The debates happen sporadically, and I would say not only minimum wages, which assumes that you have employment, are a fundamental right, but even every citizen of the country is actually entitled to a basic income so that they can survive with dignity. That is part and parcel of the right to life, I believe. And these debates have died out in the last couple of years, except sporadic ones. And I hope we will revisit this notion. Now, coming back to the topic that is assigned to me, that is minimum wages in, and how they will contribute to the resurrection or the rejuvenation of the economy, particularly now in the post-COVID crisis. Again, as we know, just a couple of days ago, the Labour Ministry has invited comments on the rules of the Code of Wages Act of 2019. In fact, it is happening for the second time. I think the first time, I believe it was a technical error. The ministry put it up on the website without a Gazette notification. And now they have notified in the Gazette and re-invited comments. The main change between the last version and this version is that the minimum wages Act is now stipulating 8 hours of work against the earlier stipulation of 9 hours of work. But if you look at the Code of Wages Act and the 4 laws it subsumes, the Payment of Bonus Act, the Payment of Wages Act, Minimum Wages Act, and Gratuity Act, and all. They all assume that you are employed in some factory or some place of work which is organized, which has a proper address, proper leadership, proper management. Now, no reference was made by Dr. Ford to the Bengal famine. I'm glad that that reference was made, because often in our own country, in India, Bengal famine is very rarely known, very rarely studied. But the Minimum Wages Act, though it might have been one of the earliest, acts to be passed post-independence, it would have also benefited people who were employed in factories, not the peasants and farmers who were fundamentally the people to die in the famine. And that would continue to be the case today. The new code does attempt to universalize the minimum wages payment. It also simplifies the definition of labor and fixes a floor wage, and is expected to reduce compliance costs for the laborers, and therefore sort of foster better compliance as compared to the existing law. However, the focus remains on the organized sector of labor, and as we know, that only 9.4% of the workforce in India is in the organized sector. The rest are in the unorganized sector, and a third sector which is emerging, which I would like to refer to as well, is the gig economy, which is totally unregulated and are completely outside the protection of the law. So now the organized sector, there are a lot of laws in India, and this is first of these 4 codes that are being set up. There is a Social Security Code, which is also under consideration of Parliament, and probably that will address some other concerns, hopefully of the unorganized sector also. But as we said, we found only 9.4% of the workforce are in the organized sector, and that has also shrunk. If you look at the EPFO subscriber database, in the new editions, they have shrunk in the last few months, and which means that new hirings are reducing. And so in spite of the stimuli that are being given, the organized sector is at the moment still shrunk, though in the lockdown 1 and post-lockdown 2, there has been some recovery, some hirings, and we can notice that there's a thrust on bringing back the workers who had migrated back to their villages and towns, back to the cities by even chartering flights. Nobody was concerned when they were going home, but now to bring them back to their workplace, that is chartering of flights and all that. But there is still debate on what kind of recession are we on. Are we on a V-shaped recession, or are we on a U-shaped recession? Are we on a W-shaped recession? The expenditure secretary last month had mentioned that we are on a V-shaped recession, which means that we have had a dip in May, April, and now we are, as post unlock 1 begins, we are on our recovery back. The trough is very small, but many economists are now beginning to say that no, India is poised for definitely not a V-shaped recovery, at least a U-shaped one, where the downside trough will be quite high, and the impact on the economy will be negative for quite a few quarters. In fact, there are predictions that not before financial year 2023, we will get back to 2020 levels of GDP. So the minimum wages, given the fact that they are applicable in a sector where there are mechanisms in the organized sector, and the organized sector is shrinking, I would make the point that they have a significant but limited contribution to make in the rejuvenation of the economy. Now, although the what we hear is that the code, wage code, will be notified in September. If the economy is what it is, if we are not even in a U curve, but we are in a W curve, and which multiple ups and downs, it may be reasonable to expect that even if there is immediate and full compliance with the code right from September or October, it's only companies with deep pockets and or highly ethical companies that will actually comply. If you look at the regulatory mechanism, which has still inspectors and people like that, it precludes people from the unorganized sector, informal sector, and others from being tracked by the code bill, even though there may be some provision in the Minimum Wages Act for factories in rural India. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say is that the organized sector has a role because it is regulated, because it is subject to laws like the Minimum Wages Act or the new Code Act. They will have some role because you can enforce the laws that are there. But we also have a big chunk of people that are not in this sector. The whole focus on, I think, in our last couple of years, the whole focus on skill development and digitization assumes, or even the Unlock 1 and Unlock 2 assumes, that the future is the organized sector. A lot of focus is given to the organized sector. The news, if you look at the news, the whole GDP is fundamentally constructed on the performance of the organized sector. The whole skill development mission, Ministry of Skill Development, assumes that there will be organized sector corporates and businesses who will need skilled labor. And so we have to provide that skilled labor. And to provide the skilled labor, we have to have these various skill development setups that are under the Skill Development Ministry and mission. The whole Digital India initiative is also based on the fact that we have a digital future, and if you are not digitally educated, then you don't have really much of a role in the economy of the country. I feel that the COVID pandemic has challenged some of these premises. When the lockdown happened at the end of March and people vacated their cities overnight almost, as factories and establishments shut down, we were able to see in front of our eyes how the formal economy, though it looks formidable on paper, can collapse almost overnight. And thousands of crops of the formal economy returned back to their villages and hometowns. And what was witnessed was something that was not very expected. They arrived back around April, May, when the Rabi crop was being harvested. And what happened was, many farmers have said this, that the agricultural sector was the least affected by the COVID crisis, because just at the harvest time, when labor is short and people have to migrate suddenly you didn't need to hire laborers because your own people were back, and they were available to work on the farm. So the agricultural sector is what is propping up the economy currently, not the organized sector. And all the the various stimuli that are being given to the economy are largely driven by the fact that the Food Corporation of India and the mandis and all have huge amount of surplus food stocks, and the government is also procuring the harvest at a much higher rate than in previous years. So I want to therefore say that the role of the informal and unorganized sector in the recovery of the economy is much more significant, and they are not regulated by any Minimum Wages Act. There are no mechanisms to enforce the wage code in the unorganized sector, and it can be safely assumed there are no enforceable minimum wages in the informal sector, many of whom may be unemployed. Which is why I mentioned briefly, I won't have time to go back to it, that if we have such a thing as the universal basic income, then you also look after the interest of the unemployed. You put some money in their pockets, and that money again is pumped back into the economy. Right now, the premise is that only the economically viable employed people can contribute to the economy, and the day you fall off that tree, you become a burden on the system. Whereas the welfare state was not meant to be constructed like that. The welfare state had to or was taking into consideration everybody, whether you were a contributing person or you were unemployed at a given point of time. But now coming back to the unemployed and the rural unemployed, we have NREGA. But NREGA is confined to the rural India. There is nothing for the urban unemployed. If there was something for the urban employed, possibly the migration might not have been that unprecedented, as people would have found some kind of jobs in the cities. Now, the thing about NREGA is the NREGA wages are lower than the minimum wages in many states, which means that if you were working in some factory in Chennai, Delhi, wherever, and you had to leave because the factory shut down, and you came back to your village and enrolled in NREGA, and it is a fact that NREGA enrollment has gone up, and more and more people have enrolled for job cards in NREGA than in previous years. In states like Rajasthan, there have been demands made that instead of 100 days a year, please allow us to work for, allow people to be working 200 days a year, because many people have exhausted their 100-day work already. So we have not estimated the value of NREGA in adding to the reconstruction of the economy. And that is something that is the only sort of systematic instrument available in the rural sector for unorganized people, where people self-select themselves and opt for work. NREGA also has some underlying premises that the Panchayat system, which is the implementing agency for NREGA, will work efficiently, which it does in some places, which it doesn't do in some places. But we need to visit and relook at the role that people in the rural India play, people in the unorganized sector play, people who are employing under NREGA can play in not only creating rural wealth and rural economy, but also in earning wages, which they then push back into the caste system. So it would be great, while we look at the focus of minimum wages as a stimulus in rejuvenating the economy, we also look at instruments like NREGA, which are being accessed at this point of time by far more people. And has even historically, it is now finished about a decade, contributed to a lot of rural wealth and contributed to the charging of the rural economy. So increasing wages in Narega, widening the scope, and putting more cash in the hands of rural India, not only will the rural economy get a boost, but it will help in reducing instances of forced and bonded labor. Because ultimately, when you earn below subsistence level, you become susceptible to other inducements, which are often exploitative in nature. And if we have already heard about human trafficking and how that happens, and how vulnerabilities have increased in the COVID period, because not everybody is able to access Narega, or the wages under Narega are not good enough, or you have exhausted your 100 working days under Narega. So I would suggest that we not just look at minimum wages, but we also give equal emphasis to Narega. Give it the same weightage as we would give to the Minimum Wages Act. The wages under Narega should be made equally, comparable. We should equate it in the same way as we are equating minimum wages under Article 21 and 22, because it guarantees a lot more people the right to live with dignity and earn their livelihood. Then there is the gig economy. The gig economy has a modern ring to it, but it is associated, with the world of startups. They have made the word gig popular. The digital world has also made gigs popular. But gigs have been existing in our, in our system for a long time. The plumbers, the electricians, the carpenters, drivers, gardeners who work for us, they don't have any contract with us. They come when our fan is faulty or AC is faulty, and they repair, they collect some money, and they go. And often informal workers, such people like that, may have multiple jobs. They pay taxes, they contribute substantially to the economy, but are not employees anywhere and enjoy no wage protection under any law. The modern gig economy, which is associated with startups, according to the World Economic Forum, is supposed to be one of the biggest trends that is going to impact work in the coming days. And it is supposed to revolutionize the way we work by reshaping careers and the way we do business. And in fact, trends are visible that even as the economy opens up in Unlock 2, more people, well-heeled corporates are turning to freelance gig workers to get their job done instead of taking on or rehiring full-time employees. Gig workers work from home often. They often work from their laptops and computers, and the relationship is a faceless relationship between the person who engages and the person who does the work. There is no employee-employer relationship. And we all know that many global corporations employ gig workers, and they have declined to call them their employees. Companies call them independent contractors who are taking on a particular job, and they may be making millions of money, dollars or rupees. But when it comes to accepting their workers, gig workers, informal workers, who may be highly skilled, by the way, unlike the unskilled laborer that we normally talk about when we talk of minimum wages. The gig worker is often pretty skilled, but he has no protection under the law. He works from home. He has his wages transferred through UPI transactions or something else. no access to provident fund, no access to social security of any kind. And the moment his work is done, he is considered dispensable. So the gig economy, again, is contributing a large amount of taxes and revenue, and is possibly going to be the game changer for corporates as they reinvent themselves in the post-COVID world, where they keep their costs low and productivity high, surrender their real estate and office spaces, and engage more and more gig workers to work from home and do tasks and get them payment. But there are no rules, there are no regulations as to how these people have to be treated. There are no minimum wages for gig workers. They have to negotiate their rates just as much as an electrician who comes home has to negotiate his or her rates for what you want done and what you are willing to pay. And so while minimum wages, paying of that, enforcing of the new Code Act would definitely contribute to the economy simply by good enforcement. There is a big 2/3 of the workforce that are either in the informal, unorganized sector with no unions kind of fighting for them. Unions by themselves have got weaker, and their voice is not often much heard except for a couple of strikes in a whole year. But unorganized sector has very rarely got any union speaking for them. Gig workers are all scattered. They're not even in one place. The typical union meeting used to be held at the factory gate, where workers used to be meeting collectively, and that evolved into collective bargaining. Today, with workers scattered around the place, unorganized, individual, fragmented, nucleated, there is no scope for them to have any collective bargaining. And even in the parliament and other places where laws are made, the gig economy and the informal sector economy has been largely ignored, even though they are contributing big sums and according to all indicators, they will contribute a large amount of money to the exchequer and contribute a large amount of money to the reconstruction of the economy in the coming months and years. We need to look at how their minimum wages and their entitlements and their employment guarantees are secured. So, I want to end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu Dutta. Thank you for seamlessly establishing the strong link between payment of minimum wages and the economic recovery in India. And human trafficking and labor exploitation can leave a dent on the economy. Ensuring timely payment of minimum wages will protect the people and boost the economy simultaneously. It will facilitate a decline in demand for cheap labor. We will give importance to Narega just as we give importance to minimum wages. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. We have reached the end of this program. The takeaways are quite a lot. And just summing up a few out of what the eminent speakers spoke this morning. Any wage above the minimum wage but below promised amount is a labor dispute. But any wage below the minimum wage is violation of fundamental rights. Minimum wage is fundamental. Minimum wage is a fundamental right under Article 21 and Article 23 of the Indian Constitution. Non-payment of minimum wage is illegal and crime. States have constitutional responsibility and employers have statutory responsibility in the issue of minimum wage. A topic which is vast as this, which is critical as this, certainly requires investment of time. It certainly requires in-depth study and action. We urge all the participants to pursue the same in your respective field of work. As rightly brought out by our distinguished speakers this morning, violation of minimum right is a criminal offense. So let us unitedly work to ensure that laborers receive what is rightfully theirs. Thank you, everyone. Now I request Mrs. Sharon Sathasivam, Head of Branding and Communications, International Justice Mission, to give vote of thanks.
Thank you, Merlin. Good afternoon, everyone. Esteemed panelists, respected members of the judiciary, journalists, professors, social workers, students, and my dear colleagues. On behalf of International Justice Mission, I would like to thank each one of you for taking the time to be here this afternoon. Thank you for your support and your participation. My heartfelt gratitude to Honorable Justice P. Sathasivam, former Chief Justice of India, for gracing this webinar with your presence and enlightening us on a topic that is very much the need of the hour. I would also like to re-emphasize a statement that he just made, that any wage above the minimum wage but below the promised amount is a labor dispute. But any wage below the minimum wage is a crime and a violation of fundamental rights as per Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. Thank you, sir. This pretty much sums up on why this topic is very important and why state governments must take non-payment of minimum wages as a serious issue. Dr. Carrie Bradford, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing in an international and cultural context on the issue, on the topic of minimum wages. You brought in a very fresh perspective by weaving together non-payment of minimum wages to other compelling issues such as poverty, gender inequality, and missing children. Dr. Shantanu Dutta, thank you so much for providing a very clear context on the impact of minimum wages on sustainable economic recovery in India. Special thanks to Ms. Merlin Freeda for moderating the webinar, providing a very clear context on the topic and steering the conversations in the right way. I must at this point mention a deep appreciation for Mr. Emalias, Additional Advocate General, Government of Tamil Nadu, for connecting us with the Honorable Justice P. Sathasivam in making this event a grand success. Thank you, sir. Behind every successful event are those umpteen number of people who are constantly working behind the scenes. And I take this opportunity to thank each one of you for all your efforts. Once again, thank you one and all for taking the time to be here today. I am so grateful for this opportunity.